Well, Sebastian Coe is a double Olympic gold medalist, one of the finest runners in sporting history, and now one of the most important figures in world sport. He's currently top dog at World Athletics, and he's in the running to be president of the International Olympic Committee. Most importantly of all, of course, he's here, live, on Uncensored. Great to see you.
It's better than the alternative.
It's fascinating time to interview you because you're one of about, I think, the 7 candidates to potentially run the IOC at a critical moment, many people think.
It's not the most exclusive club.
No. I mean, first of all, why do you want to do this?
It's everything I've ever done. I mean, I'm trying hard not to sound too cliched, but I've spent my whole life in the Olympic movement. From the age of 11, when my old man bought me my first pair of running shoes, joined an athletics club in Sheffield, and everything went. I try not to overcomplicate things. I'm sitting here because I started life as a pavement pounder. I'm a runner. And everything else has flowed from that. And I have a passion for this. And it's because I genuinely think I can make a difference.
I think you can, because I think some of the things you've done in your current job, in my opinion, are essential for preserving the integrity of sport. And let's start with what I think is probably one of the most contentious things in world sport right now, which is this whole issue of trans athletes in women's sport. Donald Trump has come into office and immediately gone, right, there's a ban. We're not going to have, in America, trans athletes in women's sport. The immediate consequence of that is, of course, you've got the Olympics coming to Los Angeles, and he's made it clear that trans athletes will not be allowed into America if they intend to compete, which means they won't be able to compete in the Olympics as far as he's concerned, because they won't get in past the border. First of all, what is your reaction to the moves he's made?
I welcome the commitment to maintaining the integrity of women's sport. And for me, this is absolutely about the integrity of competition. I am by nature a social liberal. I really do not choose, nor do I have any predisposition to tell people how to live their lives. But when it comes to the biology of sport, it is very, very clear cut. And actually, I'm surprised that it has been as contentious a discussion as it has become.
It seems completely insane to me. I mean, I'm thinking about in 20, 30 years' time, I'm convinced we're going to look back on this period and think everybody went completely nuts. Because there's a reason at the Olympics that we separate the sexes. If we didn't, women would barely win a medal. So,
well, you would lose women's sport.
Right.
It's as simple
it would be destroyed.
No, it is as simple as that. And I was confronted with this issue. I don't want to get into the weeds, but there are 2 quite distinct issues that at World Athletics we had to deal with. One was something called DSD, which is a male biology, and the other is transgender. And look, I'm not oblivious to the trauma that people go through if they do transition. I absolutely respect that. We have a working group at World Athletics looking at this and maintaining a watching view on changing science and the politics of this. We also have a transgender athlete on that commission. But when it comes to the female category in elite sport, it has to be sacrosanct. And the reason I think it's so important is that you cannot have young girls coming into the sport and sensing or feeling that at any stage there is a glass ceiling to their ability to perform at the very highest level. And you just simply cannot have this lack of clarity. So World Athletics, we were very clear. We followed the science, and that is critical. I think we've used language that is moderate. You know, we're not rabid here. And when I discuss this, I tend to always pull myself up short and say, I have 2 daughters. How would I feel if they were being discussed at this moment? So it's really important that we use language that is moderate. But for me, this is sacrosanct.
What I don't like about the whole debate, and I haven't done from the start, is that anyone that... I think my political leanings are probably not dissimilar to yours, right? I mean, I've always been a pretty liberal guy.
Middle of the road.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I've really resented the fact that if you try and defend women's rights to fairness and equality and safety, actually, you get you have been until now. It's changing quite quickly, but you get branded instantly transphobic as if somehow you're anti-trans people.
It's a really interesting point you make. Funnily enough, when we made the decision, and this wasn't a unilateral decision. I have a council. I have 26 people on my council, male and female. I've got an executive board. We have a health and science team. But actually, when we made the decision and we went out and properly articulated what our concerns were, we didn't end up in that landscape because we were very clear and we showed a lead. We took a lead here. And some other international federations, I'm very pleased, have followed in the same way. I don't condemn those that haven't, because I can't sit here assuming that everybody's going to see the world the way I do. But
but you're seeing it scientifically and biologically. I mean, there's a factual element to what you're doing. I think the other bodies who haven't taken action yet are just putting their head in the sand, hoping this all blows over and they haven't got to do anything. Which is actually, it's a form of moral cowardice.
It's the worst position to be in here is where you have lack of clarity.
Yes.
You have to have clarity here because, the world of sport needs a lead here. And we've thought about this long and hard. And it really does come down to the integrity. If you have the integrity of sport absolutely at the heart of every decision you make and the welfare of the athletes at the heart of every decision you make, you won't go far wrong. And those have been my two guiding pillars. If I let that go, then I've lost the integrity of the sport for women, and I'm just not prepared to do that.
I mean, if you at your peak, and I was in my late teens when you and Steve Ovett and Steve Cram had your magnificent battles and instilled great pride in the country with your tremendous wins. But if you had decided at the time, right, I'm gonna now identify as a woman, and the only criteria was that you just had to reduce your testosterone level, for example, which is the argument some people give. You've still got the physiology that you were given as a biological man. Therefore, you would have completely dominated women's sport to a degree that you would have broken the records, which could then never be broken again by an actual biological woman. That's always been my thing about it. You would also have deprived a biological woman, well, a woman, let's call them, they're not biological women, they're women. You would have deprived a woman of a place in an Olympic team, a world championship team, because you're taking it. And you would have won everything, right? That to me right there is the problem.
Piers, I could actually repeat word for word what you've just said. I don't actually dissent from any of it.
Yeah.
The challenge we've got is that we need to communicate this. We need to communicate it liberally, and we need to communicate it in language that is not rabid. It is follow the science.
Have you thought about
it's really, for me, it's really clear.
Yeah.
Gender must not override biology, because if you do,
completely,
then you are into a really dangerous landscape.
Have you thought about what happens to trans athletes? In other words, I want trans people to have the same rights to fairness, equality and safety as I want for women and for men, and the right to compete in sport. And it seems to me there's only one of two ways that this gets resolved where they can continue to compete. You either have a new category for trans athletes, and it doesn't work with the other way around with the trans men, because obviously they don't have the biological advantage. So, but for trans women, of whom there are an increasing number identifying as trans women, they either compete in a new category or they compete against their biological sex, it seems to me.
Well, there may be a time, and it may not be that far, and I'm not going to bind the hands of my successor at World Athletics. They will have to make a judgment in the fullness of time as whether you do have a third category.
Do you think that's the only sensible way?
No, I don't. At this moment, no, I don't. But I'm not going to sit there, when I'm not on the scenes, telling everybody that, because we did what we did when we did it. I tend to agree with you. I think we'll look back on this and see this as being a big point of inflection. But again, this is something that needs to be clarified. The position we've taken in World Athletics is that in elite level women's competition, we should not have transgender competitors for all the reasons you pointed out. I talked about the ambition and the aspiration of young girls to come into your sport.
Yeah.
You absolutely need that.
Yeah.
But there's another issue, and you raised it, and that is the residual physiological, biomechanical, anatomical advantage that you maintain. But we're not sitting here saying, nor do I don't have the jurisdiction, I certainly don't have the moral, disposition to tell trans athletes they can't enjoy the physicality of sport. If a trans athlete wanted to run in the Falmouth 5K for the local hospital, I don't have a problem with that.
No, why would anyone have a problem with that?
But it fundamentally alters. It fundamentally alters the dynamic of elite level international sport for women, and that's where we've drawn the line.
I mean, there's also, I think, a clear safety issue. Like, if you looked at the women's boxing in the Olympics in Paris with Iman Khalif, who no one's really quite sure what the situation is with Iman Khalif, other than she was banned from the World Championships for supposedly testing positive for male chromosomes. She has refused to have a public test to say either way. I think you want tests brought in. I mean,
we agreed that the other day, and it's in line with every international medical standard.
It's a simple swab test?
Yes, absolutely.
And it just determines whether you have male chromosomes?
Exactly. And actually, there is an important element here as well, because for athletes with DSD, you're actually also wanting to identify the medical challenge.
And what is, for those who don't know, what is DSD?
It is effectively a woman, a girl that is born with male biology. And the production of testosterone is the key determinant in competition. Let me, again, if I can, I'm not a scientist, but if I can put this into sort of simple terms. When my daughters, your daughters, were competing in primary school sports, up to about the age of 11 or 12, they were probably seeing off most of the boys in the class. When puberty kicks in, the gap opens, and that gap doesn't close. No. So what we're really saying is that any athlete that passes through puberty should be clearly classified. And again, the issue around the boxing, and it was just the lack of clarity.
Well, also, it was actually
the problem.
Well, I thought it was worse, actually, because you had someone who'd been banned from the World Championships over serious question marks about her alleged chromosomes, and you had a female fighter quitting after 40 seconds and saying afterwards, "I've never been hit that hard." And I found that pretty scary, that you may have a situation where somebody who, for all intents and purposes, is male, beating up a woman in a boxing ring in the Olympics.
There had to be more to it than simple identification of sex on a passport.
Right.
It was really important that you have those systems in place. And that's really all we...
What did you feel when you saw that?
Well, I'm sorry, I was on the British Boxing Board of Control for 6 years, and I have daughters. I mean, how do you think I feel?
Tell me.
Well, uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think most people did. But again, the people I think that were let down in that were, believe it or not, the competitors.
I don't disagree with that.
They were the athletes. If you'd had systems in place that were clear,
I totally agree.
And were clear and concise,
which you had as World Athletics,
that couldn't have happened.
Yeah. So that's the problem about.
And that's something we need to. That is something we have to address.
So to be clear, if you were to become president of the IOC, for example, you're in charge of the Olympics. Would one of the first things you'd want is to have utter consistency over issues like this across everyone competing?
Yes, there is a clear caveat here, because the international federations must themselves have the autonomy to make decisions that are in the best.
Can you override them?
No, and we probably shouldn't. The decision we took in World Athletics was because we felt it was in the best interest of the sport. I'm not sitting here, I'm not the kind of leader that sits there and goes, one size fits all. But what I do think is it is incumbent upon the International Olympic Committee to at least set the tone and the thought leadership around this. And international federations, I think, would take a lead. The problem is that you just have, there's no clear-cut clarity around this. And until you get that, I'm afraid you will have more examples of what we've just talked about.
I was watching CNN yesterday, and they had a sprinter called CC Telfer, who was biologically male, competed as a male for a long time, and then switched and said, I'm now a woman. And I made the point I didn't mean to be transphobic at all. I just said, look, this is somebody who presents like a man, talks like a man, sprints like a man, is a tall, powerful athlete sprinter, and is now smashing women's records. And I said, I'm sorry, but to me, it's cheating. It's as much cheating as doping, because you are deliberately seeking an unfair advantage over your competitors. Would you go as far as that?
I'm not sure I would use... I absolutely understand where you're coming from on this. I'm not sure I would use that language. What I would say is that you've got to have systems in place that prevent that from happening. And that's it. You've got to go absolutely back to basics here. Have your systems, and everybody understands what that is. I mean, look, there are a set of records in one US state that have been set by two boys that turned up in a state championship and just suddenly said to the organising committee, I
think CC Telfer was one of them.
We're assigned as women. Well, you've got to have clear-cut policies here, because you're leaving even a local organising committee in a real quandary. If you have those decisions that are made at the top and they're filtered down and they're communicated properly, then you're going to obviate a lot of the pain for athletes in this as well, because this is not an easy situation for an athlete to be in. I don't sit here thinking that anybody that chooses to become, to transition, to go through that transgender process is somebody that is going through anything other than a trauma.
But I think we should listen to people like Caitlyn Jenner, who, when you were young, you remember as Bruce Jenner winning, Olympic decathlon gold medal, wrapping himself at the time in a big American flag, but he's become a real voice of sanity in all this debate.
I know Caitlyn very well, and of course, we were not quite contemporaries, but won games before me. And I had this conversation not that long ago in the US, and I mean to introduce a slightly comedic element. She is absolutely clear that this has to be, agreed with me, that you have to have clear-cut policies, and then laughed and said, I play golf. Do you think I whack that off the women's tee? So there is a residual strength.
But she was invited to go off the women's tees originally when she first, and she said no.
No.
And she tees off the men's tees. And that's why, interestingly, the compromise in the end, it could be there's a new category, or it could be they simply compete against their biological sex, as Caitlyn does by going off the men's tees when she plays golf.
I think there is a different scale of challenge here as well, because, with all due respects, in athletics, you have somebody in that situation in an 800 metres or whatever it happens to be, they're probably going to win by half a straight. That's embarrassment and frustration. We're not a contact sport unless it goes horribly wrong and the judges have to get involved. So there is a much bigger challenge in contact sports. And that's where the safeguarding element of this and the physical safeguarding is really critical.
I'm not asking you to give a general view about President Trump, but on this issue, given he'll be president when the Olympics goes to LA, is he right on this?
He's right on the principle that, as we've just talked about, I'm not going to get into the local conditions that he's setting about, visas and all that. That is very much a US issue. If I become president of World Athletics, I'm not naive and coy. That's in my in tray. But that's something there's no certainty of outcome here. It's an election. It's, as you know well, it's not an exact science. But that is something that clearly would be a challenge. But insofar as he has set out to protect the female category, then that, the logic of what I've said has to support that nostrum.
What about Russia? Because they're currently banned by the IOC. Athletes from Russia and Belarus are only allowed to compete in Paris as neutral athletes. 32 of them competed. But I think you, as World Athletics President, you went one step further and no track and field athletes from either country were allowed to compete, even as neutral. Is that?
Yeah, but there's a bit more of a history to that, if you don't mind me saying. I became president in 2015. Talking about in-trays, I had to deal with an in-tray that contained Russia that had, in the space of less than 2 years, 149 positive tests in athletics. It wasn't something I could sit on my hands and say, oh, well, one more news cycle, we'll sort this out. And there were other things that were going on at the same time. So in 2015, we suspended the Russian Federation. We set up a task force. It was independently chaired by one of the most eminent, doping experts, anti-doping experts, a Norwegian. And bit by bit and slowly by bit, over 7 years, we actually got Russia into, and we have got them into, a decent position where the Athletic Integrity Unit, which is what I set up with my own reforms, has now got control of the testing. We've got 2 or 3 independent people. They've got a new federation. And actually, had the Russia-Ukraine situation not raised its head, they would have been ready to come back. And I would have been actually quite pleased with that, because we'd been through the process. Clearly, what works out, what happens now is a little above my pay grade and is being, discussed as we speak in Saudi.
Yeah.
So we actually introduced the concept of neutral athletes. And when I did it, everybody said, oh, it'll never work. And within a year, everybody was actually using it. But when we got to the situation, and again, it's about integrity here. This wasn't about passports or politics. I actually studied Russian history, interestingly. That's not why we did it. The same guiding principles around what we've just discussed in transgender, for me, pertained in the Russia situation. And that is that we suddenly had lost a country who had a proud tradition in track and field from being able to compete properly. The male athletes were out on the front line, some of them losing their lives. Female athletes were wondering where their husbands, boyfriends and coaches were. So it was just a very unequal situation. But look, situations alter. We have a working group that will look and monitor this and will regularly report back to the council as what situation must pertain. But you have to put process behind it. What I don't like is policy by press release and then walking away from it.
I understand. If hypothetically there was a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, and you've become president of the IOC, would you then see a scenario where Russia could come back and compete?
Yes, it's not for me to design peace treaties. I mean,
but in that eventuality,
no, in that eventuality,
the war was over.
In that eventuality, you would have to look very, very closely at that. And clearly, the world is an uncertain, complicated place, and it's not neatly packaged. I mean, all wars end with a table, a map, and people.
Right.
Depends where the table is, who's sitting around it, and what does the map look like. But that's clearly, I mean, I'm no expert in this field, but it's pretty clear that we will and can, I hope we get to that situation where this stops.
Yeah.
But if you get to a situation where you have a peace agreement, then you would have to look very closely at it.
You personally wouldn't have any ongoing issue with Russia in that eventuality?
No, you wouldn't, because the reality was you can only deal with what you deal with at the time.
But the criteria for them not coming back, the doping thing had been resolved to your satisfaction.
Yeah, I mean, the council...
So the criteria for them competing was simply that they were waging what many believe to be an illegal war in Ukraine. If that was brought to a resolution...
And the integrity of competition was being badly influenced. If we get to a situation where I hope we do, where an agreement is made and it meets with the satisfaction of both sides. I'm not an arbiter on this. I'm not sitting here making a judgment about the Versailles Treaty. But what I do, if you're logical about this and you get to that position, then it is far better to have people in your sport rather than sitting outside it.
Would the same apply to Israel? With the situation in Gaza?
Look, I don't want to get into individual cases. Israel is a very different case. and its status with the United Nations and the way that it is being dealt with, and the lack of sanction. I'm not saying I'm not falling on either side of that. In fact, much of my month is spent speaking to the Israel Track and Field Federation and the Palestine Federation, and my responsibility is to try to keep athletes in competition.
What is the current status with World Athletics with Israel and Palestinian athletes?
They can both compete,
right?
And we actually helped Palestinian athletes into training and with some financial to support, given the difficulties, and actually that was with the approval of the Israel Track and Field Federation.
There are lots of moral questions that come up here. A lot of people think there should be no conflation with politics and sport. Is it impossible to avoid?
Look, I'm sorry to say it. I won't pull my punches. That is naivety personified. Politics is the stuff of life. Sport is the stuff of life. Actually, if we're smart in sport, you should be forging even closer political relationships, because the reality of it is, if we want stadiums to be built, we want programs like kids' athletics, we want to be able to harness sport for the benefit of health and vibrancy, particularly in local communities, hard-pressed communities, then sport is the best way of doing that. And the people that have the ability to unlock those budgets are politicians. So to sit there saying that, politics and sport don't mix, they should, and we should be, there's a difference between party politics and sport, but we should be harnessing politicians. One of my real objectives, if I become president of of the International Olympic Committee, is to raise sport significantly higher on government agendas, because I will go to my grave knowing that sport is the most potent social worker in all our communities. It does it 24. Piers, you love sport.
I've just seen it. I've
seen it time and time.
Well, I'll tell you
again.
where I've just seen it really interestingly was in Saudi Arabia. I went for the first time to Saudi Arabia 2 weeks ago and spent a week in Riyadh. And they've got an incredibly young population. I think it's like 2/3 are under 35. Only 4% of Saudis are over 65. It's quite extraordinary demographic. But since they made, through the Crown Prince, they've made a decision that they're going to replace the depleting oil supplies and therefore revenues with tourism, sport, entertainment.
And diversification,
but particularly
sport.
based around sport. Yeah. This has proved incredibly popular, and he's combined it with a thing to get all young Saudis to get out and exercise at least 3 times a week. And it's proving very popular.
Yeah.
And you can see it transforming the country.
And this is what I would do to encourage all governments to recognise the extraordinary power that sport has, both in building up the health and fitness of local communities, and diplomatically, used properly, it is the deftest of political
Would you
activation.
talk if you would become president of IOC, you're one of the most powerful people, if not the most powerful person in world sport when you do that. And part of that job would be to interact with world leaders. Would you feel happy, relaxed, comfortable? How would you categorise it to pick the phone up to Vladimir Putin, for example? And would you have any issue with doing that?
Well, I do this all the time, actually, in my capacity now. I speak
at World Athletics.
At World Athletics. Just in the last few months, I've had face-to-face meetings with people like Narendra Modi. This is not unusual. And actually, before the doping crisis, which also we tend to forget raised its head also in the Sochi Winter Games, which was really where it became a really elevated issue, I'd had discussions with Russia about developing our sport at very sensible levels. So this is something I'm actually quite used to. And you have to speak to everybody. If you are promoting the cause of sport, it's not just going to be promoted by talking to ourselves. And
so you would talk to Putin?
Of course you would. Of course you would.
On the issue of doping, it's obviously been an endemic problem in many sports. We've just seen a very odd situation in world tennis, where Yannick Sinner, the world #1, came to some agreement to get a 3-month doping ban with WADA, who are the body, obviously, for tennis and the doping. He tested twice positive for a banned substance. They believed his story that he got this from a massage therapist who sprayed it on his own injured finger before massaging him and so on. But everyone's unhappy about this. Novak Djokovic said he's been shown favouritism. Nick Kyrgios said it was a sad day for tennis. coming back to your central plank of consistency here, what seems undeniable is if you were a relatively unknown professional tennis player and you'd failed 2 tests, whatever the circumstances, bang, you're thrown out for 2 to 4 years. If you're the number one, there seems to have been another rule for him.
Piers, I don't know enough about this case, and I certainly have none of the intimate details that would allow me to make any sensible judgment. What I will say is we work very closely in World Athletics with the World Anti-Doping Agency, and I actually think it's a pretty good organisation. We created in our own sport the Athletic Integrity Unit. And why did I do that? Because I sensed exactly the point you're making, that in the past, that some of our member federations from larger, more commercially expansive, more, politically well-connected, were taking different positions on some of these doping issues than the smaller federations. And, the one thing I wanted out of the Athletic Integrity Unit, I think in large part we've achieved that, is I don't want any athlete to think that they're bigger than the system and that somehow reputation or status or the proximity of a big competition is going to be a diluting factor in the way that you treat it. It's really important that, athletics is a fabulous sport, I would say that. But you can't have a situation where the athlete in lane 3 thinks that they're at a disadvantage because in lanes 2 and 4, you've got a better set of chemists at work.
Right.
It has to be free, fair, and open. And the reason you have tough anti-doping regs is not just to weed out the cheats. Yeah, that's important. It's actually to protect the athletes, those competitors that want to do this cleanly. I'm not remotely in a position to get into the individual cases of federations, but
I think you've dropped enough hints.
But the one thing that it's really important is that you have, as we've talked about, consistency of decision. And I want to see governments of all political persuasions putting more money into the World Anti-Doping Agency so it's got more teeth to protect the birthright of sport and not less.
How many cheats do you think there are?
Oh, I have no idea.
I mean, what does your gut tell you? You've been at the
My
sharp
gut
end.
tells me that this is a battle you're never going to win. That as well as I do, in every walk of life, there will be a few that are going to step beyond the written, codified moral boundaries. That's nature. Risk-reward is often a key consideration. And you've got to be culturally savvy about this as well. If you're a street kid that, is being offered through some unscrupulous coach or dealer a quick way to earning money, then the risk-reward is probably not an unreasonable one. So we need education programs that leave athletes in no doubt at all that we have the technology to pull them out, and we will do that, and it will be without fear or favour. And I think that's about the only place you can leave it. Are we ever going to be in a world where we have entirely clean sport? I think it's as unlikely as being in the city and not having isolated incidents of insider trading or malfeasance wherever it occurs.
When you think back to your big races...
human nature, really, isn't it?
When you think about your Olympic finals, for example, I don't know the answer, but do you know how many of the competitors you were up against later turned out to be cheats? Or were there others you suspected who got away with it?
Well, look, my own views about, suspicious athletes, I'll keep to myself. But you've got to remember...
Could you tell, though?
I'm now carbon dating myself. I was in a generation where we had very significantly less control than we do now. I mean, if I tell you the ability to be able to identify a thimbleful of a alien substance in a swimming pool, we've got biological passports. It's a very much tougher regime. And of course, we don't have the issue now as we did then of a divided world. Sport was very much East and West, particularly in Olympic sport.
But, I mean, is it satisfying to know you won despite the fact there were probably quite a few cheats knocking around?
On the occasional John Smith's bitter on a Friday night in Sheffield, yes.
Do you still run?
I do, every other day.
Do you?
It's a very if you saw me, it will probably be a very...
It would be a lot quicker than me.
A very charitable description.
What do you do? How far do you run?
I run an hour every other day.
Do you?
And I do a conditioning programme on the days I don't run.
And you still enjoy it?
I'm a Yorkshireman. It's cheaper than buying a new suit each year.
But do you still enjoy it?
I do. I love it. It's my mental...
What is it about running for you?
It's my mental freedom.
When you're running along now, having achieved all you've achieved, what are you thinking when you're running?
I'm just enjoying it. The reason that you go into a sport, people say you choose a sport. Actually, I think it's the other way around. I think a sport chooses you. I know you're an absolute rabid cricket fan.
Well, Lord Botham, for example,
Yeah.
has never picked up a cricket bat from the day he retired. He can't think of anything worse. He doesn't do any charity games, nothing.
Yeah.
He just said, that's it. And in fact, the last ball he ever faced was against the Australian touring team. He was at Durham. I don't know if you know this story, but the bowler came into bowl, Botham came into bowl, and an Australian batsman with, as he put it, his meat and two veg hanging out. And that was the last ball he ever bowled. He walked off afterwards, having made his little statement, and never played again. But you still run.
Well, Ian Botham's one of my heroes. You will recognise that. But again, there's a big difference when you're retired from retiring from a team sport and retiring from an individual sport.
Right.
I can put my running shoes on. If I'm staying in a hotel, I'll run the treadmill. If I'm at home, I'll just go and run wherever I'm able to do it. It's the most accessible sport. If you're beefy and you don't want to pick up and you want to play, you've probably got to be still involved in a club. You've got 4 or 5 hours. It's much easier to retire from an individual sport, as long as it's sort of fairly accessible and it's not, you're not still reliant on expensive cars or horses or yachts.
Well, talking of expensive cars, Jensen Button told me that even now when he's out in normal streets in a fast car, he comes up to traffic lights and there's someone in a Porsche. They look at him. If they see him, they're like, okay, and they want to race him. Lennox Lewis told me when he was the heavyweight champion of the world, every bar he went to in Harlem,
yeah, of course,
the big guy would want to have a fight with him, right?
Yeah.
When you're out running now, and there's another jogger comes along, right? Do you feel the old juices flowing?
Yeah, a little bit, but
I love that.
But there was a more sobering moment a couple of years ago. I was running with some friends in Australia. We were on the boardwalk up in the Sunshine Coast, and I knew my days were really well and truly over when I'm going at what I thought was a reasonable lick, and an 18-year-old kid in board shorts and flip-flops and a surfboard under his arm actually ran past us. We all looked at each other and we went, OK.
It's over.
It's over, guys.
Well, the race you're now in is to be the president of the IOC. It's March the 18th to the 21st is the actual election. It's a secret ballot. I think is it 100 members?
Yeah, about 111, yeah.
I mean, A, what do you think your chances are? And B, what is your sort of final message to them if they watch this interview as to why it should be you?
Well, the final message is I hope you've gathered from everything I've said that I think I've done within my life those jobs, those responsibilities, delivering an Olympic Games, Paralympic Games, chairing an organising committee, being active in the sport as a competitor, and president of a centre, and my political background. I'm hoping that people think I have the competence to do that, but I want to go further than that. This is not a job for me. This is an absolute passion. I think I can make a difference. And look, we all have strengths and weaknesses. I know that one of my strengths is the ability to build teams and take people with me. So look, it's ultimately up to the membership. I think we've got some massive challenges ahead. I think they're geopolitical. I think they're commercial. I think you'd get this again in a heartbeat, just the changing nature of broadcast, our ability to really continue to engage with young people and want them to fashion their futures through sport, because it goes way, way beyond the medals table and the field of play. It's a lifelong commitment. And those are the things that I think I've really understood. And I've come from a background where, everything I've done has had an Olympic or a sporting background. And I'm very proud to be able to say that.
And you're used to winning, but one of the very few people who just struck me who beat you was Steve Ovett in the greatest rivalry of all time. it just struck me. But do you still, are you mates? Do you hang out?
Yes, we are. He lives in Australia. He hasn't been in the UK for a long time, but it was a rivalry that we probably didn't ever... We were very cautious about what we said publicly about each other. But there was a moment of candour a few years ago. I was actually babysitting one of his kids while he was commentating in the Commonwealth Games. And I said to him, we were having supper afterwards, and his son Freddie, who was actually running for Australia, was asking questions, what's it like to run against my dad? And I said, look, your dad was one of the most naturally talented athletes I ever met. But I said, look, Steve was at the table. I said, Steve, I'll admit something to you, that on Christmas Day, 1979, the year before the Games, I was in Sheffield. It was a Wagnerian winter. The snow was coming down. I'm sounding a bit like the three Yorkshiremen out of Monty Python. I'm trying hard not to. And I ran that morning about 13 or 14 miles in horrendous conditions. And during the afternoon with the 900th rerun of The Sound of Music or Dam Busters, I felt uneasy. I couldn't figure out what it was. And I suddenly sat there thinking, I bet he's out doing another training session. So completely obsessionally, I went up to my room, put my kit on, and just went out and ran another 5 miles, came back and felt really good. And I told him that story. This is years later. And he looked at me and he went, did you only go out twice that day? 35 years later. We're still scoring points off each other, but he was an outstanding athlete.
That's great, great. It's great to see. This might be the kiss of death, but you've got my endorsement. I actually think you'd be brilliant in this job, and I hope they see sense and give it to you, not just because you're a Brit, and that would be great for us, but I think you've got the right ideas for this. It's a big job that needs big ideas and a bit of moral courage. And I think you've got that, and that's what we needed running world sport right now. A bit of moral balls under fire, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, I may not include that in the manifesto.
That might not be the winning phrase, actually, now I think about it.
Thank you for the sentiment.
But good to see you. Best of luck.
It's great to see you.
All the best.
Thank you.
Piers Morgan Uncensored is proudly independent. The only boss around here is me. If you enjoy our show, we ask for only one simple thing. Hit subscribe on YouTube and follow Piers Morgan Uncensored on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And in return, we will continue our mission to inform, irritate and entertain. And we'll do it all for free. Independent, uncensored media has never been more critical, and we couldn't do it without you.